Well, hello and hello, everybody. Welcome to OG Roz and the Butterfly. If you're new here, go ahead, like, share, and subscribe, and hit the bell notification so you will not miss an upload. Alrighty, today is day 4 of the Keefe D trial. So let's get into this. Let's talk about it today. All right. So, was Tupac set up? The shocking battle for Compton theory. I watched some of that last night, but I fell asleep, not because it was boring, it's just because it was late. But I do intend to watch that whole thing at some point. But anyway, what's up, everybody? It's OG Roz. Today we're going somewhere a little different with the Tupac Shakur murder case. Because after watching the documentary Tupac Assassination, Battle for Compton, I walked away with some serious questions. And I need to make something clear before we begin. What I'm discussing today includes theories and allegations presented in this documentary and associated with former LAPD detective Russell Poole. These allegations have not all been proven in court, and several people accused in these theories have strongly denied them. So when you have time, go ahead and watch that, the assassination, Tupac assassination. Battle for Compton. Boring at some point, but then it gets down to the nitty-gritty. Okay, so don't give up on it. Plus, don't watch it when you're tired, because you're going to end up having to rewind it again and again, like I did last night. And then I kept falling asleep, so then when I wake up, I'd have to start off where I remember leaving off. But anyway, so we're not declaring anybody guilty, though. We're examining the theory. And believe me, this theory is shocking. So this isn't just about Orlando and Keefe D. For years, we've heard essentially the same basic theory. Tupac and members of the death row entourage attack Orlando Anderson inside the MGM Grand. Right? Then Orlando Hold on, what happened to my music? And then Orlando is a Southside Compton Crip. Keefe D and other members of that group allegedly found out what happened. They allegedly obtained a gun, go looking for Tupac and Suge Knight, find them on the Las Vegas Boulevard, pull alongside Suge's BMW in a white Cadillac, and somebody opens fire. That's the theory most people know, right? But Battle for Compton asks us to consider something completely different. What if what happened at the MGM wasn't the entire story? What if there were problems developing inside and around Death Row Records itself? And what if some of the strange things that happened on September 7th, 1996 weren't merely coincidence? Then enters Russell Poole. Russell Poole wasn't simply some random internet conspiracy theorist. He was a former LAPD detective who became deeply involved in investigating corruption involving LAPD officers and eventually the murder of Christopher Wallace, the notorious B.I.G. Over time, people's thinking about the Tupac and Biggie cases evolved. Toward the end of his life, he was working with Michael Douglas Carlin and Richard Bond, whose work became connected with the theory presented in Battle for Compton. And Poole came to believe investigators had been looking in the wrong direction. According to his theory, Tupac's murder wasn't simply a spontaneous gang retaliation. There was something much bigger happening. So this is where this documentary really turned everything upside down for me. Shocking question number one. Was Tupac even the primary target? The documentary's theory proposes that Suge Knight may actually have been the intended target of the Las Vegas shooting. Think about it. We've spent almost 30 years assuming Tupac was the target. Suge happened to be driving, but Poole's later theory asks us to reverse it. What if Suge was the target and Tupac was caught in the attack? According to reporting about Battle for Compton, the theory alleged that Suge's estranged wife, Sharitha, and Death Row security figure Reggie Wright Jr. were involved in a conspiracy connected to control of Death Row Records. Now stop right there. This is an allegation, okay? Sharitha has emphatically denied it. Reggie Wright Jr. has denied involvement. Neither should be treated as guilty simply because a documentary accused them. But this was part of Russell Poole's later theory. And the alleged motive was extraordinary. Control of Death Row Records. Now I can see that. Sorry, I'm trying to get my leg in a more comfortable spot. All right. So who benefited if Suge was gone? Who reportedly began asking a very basic detective's question. Who benefits? Death Row wasn't just a record label. At its height, this was an extraordinarily valuable music empire. Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, Tupac Shakur, hit records, tours, publishing, masters. Millions upon millions of dollars moving through this organization. And according to Poole's theory, there was an internal struggle developing around this empire. So people asked, if Suge Knight died, who would gain power? And that's where the documentary begins, examining people inside Suge's own circle. And they showed a picture on the album cover of Lil Half Dead's album cover. I didn't put it up because it looked pretty graphic, but it's in a cart. It's like a cartoon version of the recording studio, and Tupac's look like his brains are blown out, and he's laying over the musical equipment, and then Yaki Gaddafi is in the background and looking like his brains have been shot out. Now that's terrible, right? I would show you the picture, but I think it might be too graphic to show. But you can look for it. You know what? I had a hard time finding it, actually. Should I post that picture really quick? Do a flash? What do you guys think? All right, let's do it really quick. One more. Let me see if I can do this. Okay. Come on now. So what do you guys think so far about everything that's been going on in the courtroom? You know, today they listened to the interview with Greg Kading and Keefe D and whoever else was there for that proffer agreement. Isn't that something else? Yes, they did. Okay. Come on now. Oh, got the wrong person. Okay, I'm going to put it up real quick. All right, I'm back. I didn't mean for that picture to stay up there so long, but I started having little difficulties. But yeah. Okay, and then there's security. This is one of the parts I want you guys to really think about. Tupac Shakur was one of the biggest stars in America. He had enemies. There had already been an attempt on his life in New York. He was surrounded by controversy. And hours earlier, Tupac had just participated in beating a known gang member inside the MGM Grand. So you would think security that night would have been extraordinarily tight. Instead, Tupac ends up riding in the passenger seat of a BMW with Suge driving. He don't have on the bulletproof vest or anything. And the rest of the death row caravan are following behind. Even Frank, his personal security guard, he thought that was rather strange, especially after the fight they had with a known Crip. going to just ride in the car with Shug without any security, without any bulletproof vest or anything? Yeah, I don't know what's going on here. What do you guys think? And the documentary raises serious questions about death row security arrangements that evening. So I have a question. How did one of the most famous and endangered rappers in America become that exposed? Maybe there is an innocent explanation, but if you're investigating a murder, you have to ask the question. And how did the shooters find that BMW? This is another question that bothers me. Las Vegas, September 7th, 1996. Fight night, Mike Tyson fight. Thousands of people, cars everywhere. Tupac and Shug leave the MGM. They move through Vegas traffic. Police stopped their BMW at one point because there was no license plate on the car. But other people say, oh, because the music was too loud. Well, they're ultimately sitting at Flamingo and Koval, and suddenly a white Cadillac appears, pulls alongside them. Gunfire erupts. So here's my question. How did whoever was in that Cadillac know exactly where Tupac and Shug were? The Keefe D explanation is straightforward. They were looking for them. They were looking for them, right? And they knew everybody was headed toward Club 66. They searched until they found them. That's possible. But Battle for Compton encourages us to ask another question. Did someone know exactly where that BMW was going to be? Again, question. That's a question, not a fact. And Club 662 becomes very important because everybody was supposedly heading towards Shug's Club 662. And this is where some of the historical accounts involving people around death row become fascinating. There have been claims over the years about members of the Southside Crips fleeing around Club 662. And if that's true, then we need to understand exactly when they arrived, who saw them, and how they knew where Tupac was headed. Because that timeline matters. Were they simply hunting Tupac after the MGM beating? Were they already near the club? Did somebody tell them where the death row entourage was going? Those are very different scenarios. Then there's the MGM fight. Here's another thing I've been thinking about. The MGM beating becomes the centerpiece of the prosecution's retaliation theory. Tupac sees Orlando, Tupac attacks him, other death row associates join in, and supposedly that sets everything in motion. But Battle for Compton invites a different kind of question. Was that fight simply the catalyst for everything that happened afterward, or did it provide a convenient explanation for a murder connected to something larger? And I'm not saying it was staged, but there is no established evidence that Tupac was instructed to attack Orlando as part of a murder setup. But when evaluating this documentary theory, that's one of the questions hanging over the entire sequence of events. Because the fight creates an obvious motive, gang retaliation, case closed, unless something else was happening simultaneously. And now we have Keefe D. And this is where things get really complicated. Because regardless of Russell Poole's theory, we cannot ignore Keefe D. Keefe D has publicly placed himself in the Cadillac. He has described who was supposedly inside it. He has discussed obtaining the gun from Zip. He has described looking for Tupac and Shug. Those statements are a major reason we're sitting here decades later talking about a murder prosecution. So if Keefe D was telling the truth, how does he fit into Russell Poole's theory? That's the question I can't get past, because these two theories appear to collide. So could both stories contain part of the truth? Well, here's something I'm asking, not something I'm claiming. What if Keefe D really was involved, but didn't know everything happening around him? What if the Cadillac was real? What if the Southside Crips were involved? But what if somebody else had additional motives? Or alternately, what if Poole's later theory was simply wrong and Keefe D's retaliation account explains what happened? Those are possibilities investigators have to separate with evidence, because proving that Keefe D participated doesn't automatically prove every conspiracy theory about death row. And suspicious activity surrounding death row doesn't automatically prove Keefe D was innocent. Both propositions need their own evidence. So who actually pulled the trigger? Then we reach the biggest unanswered question. Who fired the gun? Keefe D has implicated Orlando Anderson, his nephew. Other theories have pointed elsewhere. Battle for Compton challenges the conventional account entirely. But where is the physical evidence conclusively identifying the shooter? That's why I keep coming back to Suge Knight, because Suge was sitting right there. Tupac was inches away from him. If anybody potentially saw the shooter clearly enough to identify that person, it would be Suge Knight. Right? And that's why his perspective remains so important. And hey, y'all, what if Suge Knight had a gun? Maybe some of those gunshots came from him too. I don't know. Something else about Suge. There's another reason the documentary's theory is fascinating. If Suge really orchestrated Tupac's murder, as some conspiracy theories have claimed over the years, why would he arrange an attack while he himself was sitting directly beside Tupac? That's extraordinarily risky. The Battle for Compton theory flips that around. It proposes maybe Suge wasn't organizing the assassination. Maybe somebody was trying to assassinate Suge, and Tupac died instead. That changes the entire way you look at that BMW. But there's an important problem. Years after the documentary's release, reports circulated claiming Suge had confirmed the filmmaker's theory, though through his attorney. So Suge actually said that Russell Poole had it right. But Suge's attorney subsequently denied making statements on Suge's behalf, confirming the documentary's allegations. That's important, because when we're investigating something this serious, we can't repeat a sensational headline without also giving you the denial. So I'm not going to tell you Suge confirmed Russell Poole's right. That's disputed. So what Russell Poole was really asking, I think the most important thing about Poole's theory isn't necessarily accepting his conclusion. It's examining his question. Follow the money, follow the power. Look at who controls security. Look at who benefited afterwards. Look at the relationship inside death row. Look at who knew Tupac's movements. Look at who had access to whom. Look at the Cadillac. And then ask whether all those pieces actually fit together. Because detectives shouldn't start with the answer and force evidence into it. You follow the evidence wherever it leads. And now we have a real trial. And this is why watching the Keefe D trial after watching Battle for Compton is so fascinating. Because now I'm listening differently. When somebody testifies about the MGM, I'm listening. When somebody talks about Club 662, I'm listening. When somebody discusses death row security, I'm listening. When somebody says they saw Keefe D, I'm listening. When somebody describes that white Cadillac, I'm listening. And when witnesses contradict stories they told publicly for years, I'm definitely listening. Because now there is a courtroom where statements can finally be challenged under oath. So my biggest question, after everything we've heard, my biggest question remains simple. Was Tupac Shakur merely found that night? Or was Tupac Shakur placed in a position where he could be found? These are two completely different things, right? And right now, I don't believe a documentary alone can answer that question. Neither can rumors. Neither can YouTube interviews. Evidence has to answer it. Okay, so but remember, the Bible tells us in Luke 8:17, for all that is secret will eventually be brought into the open, and everything that is concealed will be brought to light and made known to all. So people can hide things from investigators, people can hide things from courts, people can hide things for 5 years, 10 years, even 30 years. But nobody hides anything from God. If Keefe D participated, God knows. If Orlando pulled the trigger, God knows. If somebody else did it, God knows. And if anybody inside of or outside death row helped arrange what happened, God knows that too. And if people have been falsely accused for 30 years, God knows that too. That's why we seek truth without declaring people guilty based upon rumors. Because ultimately there is one judge who has every piece of evidence, and he doesn't get the verdict wrong. Now let's get into the trial and what happened today. Okay, Keefe D trial day 4 highlight. Did we learn something new today? And who is winning? What's up, everybody? Let's get into this. So we finished another day in the Tupac Shakur murder trial. And today, August 20th, 2026, was important because today wasn't simply another witness telling us what happened almost 30 years ago. Today, the jury got to hear Keefe D tell the story himself. And after everything we've heard this week, I think we finally have enough information to start asking, who's winning this case right now? The prosecution or the defense? Well, let's talk about it. Let's talk about it. So the big story today, that 2008 interview, that proper agreement, okay? The centerpiece of today's proceeding was Keefe D's 2008 interview with law enforcement. Remember, this wasn't a YouTube interview. This wasn't Keefe D promoting a book. This wasn't a podcast. This was Keefe D sitting down with investigators, and the jury heard the whole recording. And that's potentially a serious problem for the defense, because their strategy has basically been, don't believe Keefe D. They're saying this man exaggerated. He told stories. He wanted attention. He wanted to sell books. In other words, the defense needs this jury to believe that their own client has been lying about his involvement in Tupac's murder. But today, prosecutors essentially said, okay, then listen to what he told police back in 2008. Now, one thing I noticed today is Keefe D's demeanor appeared different at the very beginning. He walked out, he looked like very humble. He didn't have this hard, rough, kind of bite your head off look. Did you see how he kind of halfway hugged his attorney? So maybe he told him that you gotta look more humble so people will feel sorry for you. I don't know. But anyway, let's talk about what Keefe D said. In the recorded interview, Keefe D placed himself inside the white Cadillac to describe 4 men being in that vehicle. Keefe D, Terrence T. Brown, DeAndre Ray Smith, and Orlando Baby Lane Anderson. So it's 4 of them, okay? But then comes the bombshell. According to Keefe D's account to investigators, Orlando Anderson fired the shots that killed Tupac. And Keefe described the gun being passed inside that Cadillac. That is huge. Sorry, y'all. All right. So anyway, so that's huge, right? Because prosecutors aren't trying to prove that Keefe D personally pulled the trigger. Their theory is that Keefe D participated in the operation and supplied or facilitated the weapon. So if the jury believes Keefe's own description of what happened, the prosecution may not need to prove that Keefe fired a single bullet. And that's why today hurt the defense. Think about the position Keefe D's attorneys are in. They have to tell this jury, don't believe our client. Keefe told investigators he was there. Don't believe him. Keefe described the Cadillac. Don't believe him. Keefe described the gun. Don't believe him. Keefe identified Orlando. Don't believe him. Then he talked about it publicly years later. Don't believe that either. Then he wrote about it in a book. Don't believe that. At some point, I think a juror could reasonably ask, how many times can somebody tell essentially the same incriminating story before I stop believing that every version was made up? That's the danger for the defense. But hold on. The defense still has an argument, though. And I'm not ready to declare this case over, not even close, because there is still a major weakness in the prosecution's case. Where is the independent evidence proving Keefe D was actually inside that Cadillac? That's the question the defense is going to hammer. Where's the fingerprint? Where's the DNA? Where's the photograph showing Keefe inside the Cadillac? Where's the videos? Where's the surviving eyewitness who looked inside that car and can definitely tell this jury, I saw Keefe D? That's where the defense still has room to fight. Their argument is essentially, you have Keefe's mouth, but where is your proof? So did we actually learn anything new today? Yes and no. People who have followed this case closely have known about the 2008 interview for years. So the basic story isn't new to us, right? But something important is new in the context of this trial. For the first time, this jury is hearing Keefe's statements as evidence in an actual murder trial. And hearing someone's voice can be very different from an attorney describing what somebody supposedly said. The jury gets to listen to his words, his tone, his level of detail, his description of the people involved. And then jurors decide, does this sound like a man making up a story? Or does this sound like a participant describing something he actually experienced? That decision could ultimately determine this entire case. And there's another problem for the defense. The defense says Keefe made these stories up for money and notoriety. Okay. That argument makes more sense when you're talking about later interviews, podcasts, and his memoir. But prosecutors can point to the fact that the 2008 statement came before much of that later publicity. So the defense has to explain why Keefe was already telling investigators an incriminating story years before the later media attention they're blaming for his supposed exaggerations. He even said, I didn't write the book. Well, you had to tell the man who wrote it something. It's your story. That doesn't automatically prove Keefe was telling the truth, though. But it makes the defense explanation more complicated. And there's something else I noticed. The prosecution appears to be building this case piece by piece instead of looking for one dramatic eyewitness. First, establish Tupac was shot. Okay, so that's where the autopsy part came into question. Establish the scene. Establish the BMW. Establish the Cadillac. Establish the gang relationships. Establish what happened at the MGM. Establish the rivalry. Establish what witnesses remember. And then let Keefe D's own words connect him to that Cadillac. That's actually a smart prosecution strategy, because they don't necessarily need one witness to walk into court and say, I watched Keefe plan Tupac's murder. They can attempt to build a chain of circumstantial evidence and then put Keefe's own statements right in the middle of it. But the prosecution has a problem too, though, and I'm going to be fair. We've already seen witnesses who don't remember everything. We've seen inconsistencies. We've seen testimony that doesn't necessarily fit neatly into one story. And we're talking about events that happened almost 30 years ago. Memories fade, people die, physical evidence disappears, stories change, and some people involved in this case have given interviews for decades. That's fertile ground for reasonable doubt. And what about Mob James? I still haven't forgotten Mob James, because earlier this week, James McDonald was clearly a reluctant witness. He called himself a hostile witness. He acknowledged the gang conflict that erupted after Tupac's death, but he wasn't exactly eager to start naming people. And I still think there is an important question surrounding his previous public discussions about seeing Southside Crips around Las Vegas and Club 662. If someone has previously said Keefe or members of that group were there, I want to know why. And I want to know whether prosecutors can corroborate Keefe's presence in Las Vegas independently of Keefe's own mouth, because that could become extremely important. Now let's connect this to Battle for Compton. And this is where yesterday's discussion gets really interesting. We just talked about Russell Poole and the Battle for Compton theory. That documentary asked whether something bigger was happening around death row. Questions about security, questions about who knew Tupac's movements, questions about Suge Knight, questions about Club 662, and questions about people surrounding death row. So today's evidence doesn't necessarily disprove all of those questions, but it creates a huge obstacle for any theory that completely removes the Southside Crips from the murder. Why? Because now the jury has heard Keefe D himself describe being inside the Cadillac. So here's the question I have now. What if the answers isn't necessarily one theory or the other, like I said earlier? Could Keefe D have been involved while other suspicious things were happening around death row? Possibly. But we need evidence before turning that possibility into a conclusion. So who is winning right now? If you force me to score this case after day 4 only, I would give the advantage to the prosecution. Not because they've proven the entire case beyond a reasonable doubt already. They haven't. But because Keefe's own recorded statements are powerful evidence if the jury believes them. The defense problem is unusual. Normally, a defense attorney attacks the prosecution's witnesses. Here, the defense also has to attack their own client's credibility. Their argument basically requires jurors to believe. Yes, Keefe repeatedly said incriminating things, but he was lying. That's possible, but it's risky. So what would change my mind? Well, if the defense can demonstrate that important portions of Keefe's story are factually impossible, that's different. If they can prove Keefe wasn't in Las Vegas, that's huge. If they can demonstrate that the Cadillac occupants were different, that's huge. And if they can show investigators fed Keefe critical details, huge. If they can establish that his 2008 statement was protected in a way that prevents prosecutors from using it as they are attempting to right now, that's another major issue. And if credible witnesses identify somebody completely different as the shooter or occupants, then we've got a different ball game. But right now, the prosecution has the momentum. So the question the jury may eventually have to answer, this case may ultimately come down to something remarkably simple. Was Keefe D lying then, or is Keefe D lying now? Because both versions cannot be true. For years he described involvement. Now he's pleading not guilty, and his defense says those stories were fiction. The jury has to determine which Keefe D they believe. So my biggest takeaway from today didn't solve Tupac's murder. It didn't answer every strange question surrounding death row. It didn't settle Russell Poole's theory, and it didn't conclusively prove who pulled the trigger. But today did something extremely important, though. It brought Keefe D's own voice into the courtroom. And now prosecutors can effectively tell the jury, don't take our word for it. Listen to him. The defense responds, don't believe him. And ladies and gentlemen, that may become the battle that decides this entire trial. So, what are your thoughts on this? I'm going to keep an open mind, y'all. I'm going to try to keep an open mind because the prosecution hasn't finished. The defense hasn't presented its entire case, and the jury hasn't rendered a verdict. But whatever happened on September 7th, God already knows the truth. And our job isn't to make somebody guilty because we don't like them. It isn't to make somebody innocent because we do like them. So follow the evidence, test what people say, and let the truth speak for itself. This is OG Roz. Now I want to hear from you after day 4. Who you think is ahead? Prosecution, defense, or are you still undecided? And here's the bigger question. After hearing Keefe D's 2008 interview, do you believe he was confessing or storytelling? Put it in the comments. Like, subscribe, and share the video. And I'll be right back with the next trial update. See you guys tomorrow. Now, I may not post a video tomorrow because I have plans tomorrow. So if I don't get it in tomorrow, I will put it up over the weekend. All right? All right. Have a blessed day. And don't forget to pray.